Alrighty. Today is the second week of our series on apologetics, and as I said last week, we are basically going through the 12 points that show Christianity is true as we find in this book. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turk. Again, as I mentioned, you don't have to read the book necessarily. What we're going to be doing is summarizing that book. But what they've done is that they have basically 12 steps that go through and show you that Christianity is the one and only true religion. And it's along the way we look at the evidence for the truth of the Christian faith. And so today what we're going to look at are two things. We're going to look at what's called the law of non-contradiction, which is kind of, again, an important part of the basis that we're forming. And then we're going to begin to examine the evidence for the existence of God. Those are the two things we want to try and accomplish this morning. So before we do, let me just review a little bit about what we talked about last week. And as I was mentioning last week, when Dr. Geisler developed these 12 steps, originally it was 10 steps, and then after going through all 10, he, the person says, well, that could be true for you, but it's not true for me. And so he realized we have to talk about, in these days, in this culture, the nature of truth. A lot of times before we can even get to the gospel, before we can even get to does God exist and who is Jesus Christ. And so that's why we start with this foundation, the nature of truth. And last week we showed that truth is what corresponds to its object. Truth corresponds to reality. If I make a truth claim, if I say this is a Bible, the reason that that statement is true is because this in reality is a Bible. If I were to say that this is a Bible or this is a Bible, that would be false because my statement doesn't match reality. It doesn't match what these things actually are. So truth is which corresponds to its object or corresponds to reality. And therefore, truth is objective and it's not based on personal opinion. Truth is not subjective. Truth is objective. What is true for everyone, everywhere, at all times. If I say that this is a cell phone, that's true for me, it's true for you, that this is a cell phone, it's true for everybody, everywhere. And so the same is true when it comes to religious matters. If God exists, then that's true for me, and it's true for you, and it's true for everybody else. A person can no longer say, well, if you want to believe in God, that's fine, that's true for you. No, that's not the nature of truth. If God does exist, then He's there, and that's true for everybody. So that's what we were talking about last week in terms of the nature of truth. Today, we want to talk about one more thing that the philosophers give us, which is helpful, and that is point 2. And point 2 on our list of 12 points is that the opposite of true is false. Now that sounds like something we would be talking about in the second grade, and here we are, a bunch of adults sitting around talking about this concept of the opposite of true being false. But this is a very, very important concept. And it's sometimes known as the law of non-contradiction. And that simply states that opposites cannot both be true at the same time. Opposites cannot both be true at the same time. And that's fairly obvious. I cannot say that I'm here in New Jersey this morning, and at the same time I'm in Nebraska. Those are opposite. They both simply cannot be true at the same time. I'm in only one place. I'm only in New Jersey. It's interesting that you can't deny this law without using it. That's really the pretty incredible thing. For example, anyone who says that opposites can both be true doesn't believe the opposite of that statement. You see what I'm saying is true. They are against the opposite of what they're saying. So even if they were to say there's no such thing as the law of non-contradiction, opposites can both be true, they don't believe the opposite of that statement is true. So it's one of those things that you can't deny without using it. So the law of non-contradiction holds all the time. Opposites simply cannot be true. Anyone who makes a truth claim believes that everything opposed to it is false, right? If I'd say to you, this is a cell phone, then I believe that everything opposed to that is false. This is not an elephant. It is not an automobile. Okay? It is not a chair. It's a cell phone. So all other statements that would apply to this would be false, because opposites cannot both be true at the same time. How does this apply, or why does this apply to religion, to spiritual matters? Well, if Christianity is true, then everything opposed to it is false. If Christianity is true, then every other belief system, every other religion is rendered false. So the big question is Christianity true? And that's what we're going to be looking at as we walk through the rest of these 12 steps. But the thing that we have to also remember is that if atheism is true, then everything opposed to it is false. That would make Christianity false, if atheism turned out to be true. And as we talked about last week, truth, sometimes Christians are accused of being narrow-minded. Oh, how can you believe that Jesus is the only way to salvation? How can you believe that Christianity is the only true religion? And they call us narrow-minded and intolerant. Well, the fact is that atheists believe that everything opposed to what they believe is false. And so the atheists are equally narrow-minded, are they not? In fact, that's true of anybody who makes a truth claim. You believe that what you're saying is true and everything opposed to it is false. So again, that's an accusation that just doesn't hold when they accuse us of being narrow-minded. Truth is narrow, as we said. 2 plus 2 equals 4, not 7 or 5 or 11. Truth is narrow. And so it's empty-minded, not narrow-minded, to think otherwise. So that is the law of non-contradiction. The opposite of true is false. So by point 1 in our 12 points, we know that we can know truth about reality, we can know objective truth about reality, and the opposite of what is true, would be false. And so with that groundwork, we want to move forward now and to begin to look at evidence for the existence of God. If Christianity is true, we have to begin with God. Does God exist? So point 3 is, it is true that the theistic God exists. It is true that the theistic God exists. Now, there are, generally speaking in the world, there are 3 major views of God. There are others. We don't have time in this series to go through every single view or understanding, but these 3 views capture most of what people believe about God. So the first view would be theism. And theism is the view that God created the world and he is separate from it. He is the creator, we are the creatures. His handiwork is the universe. That is theism. The second view is called pantheism. I don't know if you've heard about this, but pantheism is a view that God and the world are one and the same. God is the world and the world is God. And you find this view in many of the Eastern religions. Buddhism, for example, has this view that everything is basically, that exists is one. And when you die, you become part of the one. And in Hinduism, the Brahman would be the kind of the overall one of everything. And the world is actually part of God. It is identified with God. And then the final view is atheism, which basically says there is no God. The material world is all that exists. The material universe is all that exists. And so those are the 3 major views. And as we said, because of the law of non-contradiction, if any one of those views is true, the others must be false. So the question is, how do we determine which, if any, of these is true? And that's what so keep in mind, what we're trying to do in this series is we are going from the ground up, and we are trying to demonstrate to those who are non-believers, who are perhaps atheists, that Christianity is true. So you have to start from ground zero. We start by establishing the nature of truth, and whatever contradicts that is false. And now we're going to say, we believe of these 3 views that theism is correct. On what basis would we choose theism over atheism or pantheism? So what we're going to do is look at 3 lines of evidence that will show that theism is the correct view of these 3, and that the other options would have to be false. There are lots of other types of evidence for the existence of God. Again, we don't have time in this series to go into all of it. If any of you are interested in further reading, please see me, and I can easily point you in a direction where you could find more. But we're going to look at three. And those three lines of evidence are the cosmological argument, and the design argument, which is sometimes called the teleological argument, and the moral argument. Those are three arguments that will argue that God exists and that there really is no other reasonable view that you can hold. So that's what we're going to go over the next several weeks. And what I want to do today is spend the bulk of our time talking about the cosmological argument. And sometimes that's referred to as the argument from first cause. But on the top of your next page, this is how the argument is basically stated. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe had a cause. Okay? So everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. And the universe began at some point, so the universe needed a cause. And, you got to think, what could there be that could cause the universe to begin to exist? All right? That's the Bible has an answer in the very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and that the phrase heavens and the earth is a reference to the entire universe. But the atheist would disagree and say, no, that's not necessarily true. We can't use the Bible. That's just your holy book, and there's lots of holy books in the world. So part of what we're going to be doing here is arguing for the existence of God without using the Bible. That way, the atheist cannot say, oh, well, you're just depending on the Bible and that's your own book, so that's not really very persuasive. We're going to argue from science. See, that's an area that atheists love, and we can argue from a scientific standpoint that God exists. And to me, that's just fascinating. We don't have to, of course the Bible is totally true, and hopefully once our atheist friend becomes a Christian, they will agree with that as well. But to begin with, we approach them on their ground. So let's look at this argument for a second. The first premise says that something does not come from nothing. So what I did to try, because this is a really important concept, and to try and explain this, I brought this shoebox, and you'll notice the color matches your folders quite nicely. Where else can you go? Where you can have a shoebox as a prop matching the color of your notes. That's why you pay so much money for this course, right? Here's the shoebox, and it's totally empty, right? Nothing in the shoebox. So let's say we take this shoebox and I put the cover on it, and I get the cover on somehow, and I put this shoebox on the shelf for a week, and nobody touches that shoebox. It just sits there for a week. Well, the next week when I come back and I open this box, what would I expect to find? Would I expect to find a baseball in this box? Or a nickel?
$1 million.
Yeah. What would be in this box?
Air.
Nothing, right? Because if there was nothing to begin with, then nothing is all you'd ever have in there unless somebody monkeyed with it, okay? Unless somebody put something in there. Then you could have something in there. But if no one touched it, if there was absolutely nothing in there, nothing is all that you would ever have in there. Because why? Nothing only produces what? Nothing, right? So if you have nothing, nothing is all you'll ever have. Now let's say this. Let's just say that inside this shoebox is the entire universe. Okay? Hard to imagine. Universe is a pretty big item. But let's just say that the entire universe fits in this box. Okay? And we live in there. Okay? It's all happening in here. We're a very, very tiny speck inside the box, inside of our universe. But let's go back in time. We'll travel back in time to a moment before the universe came to be. Okay? So we're going to go back in time before the universe started, and what's inside the box? Nothing. And we're going to say, for the sake of argument, that the atheists are correct, that God does not exist. Sake of argument, okay? So let's go back. There's nothing in the box, there's no universe, and there's no God. There's absolutely nothing. What is ever going to happen inside this box?
Nothing.
Yeah, is anything ever going to appear inside this box? Will there ever be a baseball or a nickel or a universe? No. Right. Because if there's nothing, nothing is all you're ever going to have. The only way that a universe could appear in this box is if somebody put the universe in there. There has to be something outside the universe to put it in the box, to get it going, to make it, to create it, to cause it to come to be. Does that make sense? See, if the atheists are correct, and there was a time when there was absolutely nothing, then what is all that would ever exist? Nothing. See? Nothing. We would be in a state of nothingness for eternity. But the problem the atheist has is that we exist. Something exists. And you have to explain where it came from. Where did the universe come from? And that is a problem that vexes the atheist scientific community. They don't have an answer for where the universe originally came from. It is a deep, deep problem for them. But I think this argument alone... All righty. Well, thank you. We'll get that later. It's just water. But that is the problem that the atheist has, is to explain where the universe came from. That's a big question. So in my notes, it says, the first premise of our argument says something does not come from nothing. A baseball doesn't suddenly appear in an empty box out of nowhere. It must be placed there by someone. In other words, it has to have a cause for coming into the shoebox. That makes sense to you now, hopefully, right? Follow that? So the big question is, why is there something rather than nothing? If there was a time when absolutely nothing existed, there would be nothing there to make or create anything. Nothing is all that there would ever be. Right? So in order for something to exist, in order for our universe to come into existence, something has to be eternal. Something has to have the power of self-existence and to have been there all the time in order for something to come into existence. Does that make sense?
To us, yes.
Yeah, it does. Something has to have always been there. And the best explanation is what, the atheist scientific community refuses to say that God is the cause of the universe, so they struggle, for an explanation. They come up with some pretty silly things sometimes. But they just simply do not have an answer. So that's really the bottom line. And this argument is so persuasive. The late R.C. Sproul, who is a theologian, he thought this was the strongest argument for the existence of God. He said this one just nails it shut. I mean, you don't even have to go on and look at any of the other arguments as far as he was concerned. He thought this was just absolutely incontrovertible, that the universe has to have an explanation for its existence, and God is the only explanation that there could be. If you don't have God, what other explanation is reasonable for the creation of the universe? What other possibility could there be? It is just very, very difficult question for the atheist to answer. So that is the question. But then that all hangs on the fact that the universe is not eternal. And for a long time, scientists actually believed that the universe was eternal. And as long as you have an eternal universe, you don't have to answer this question, where did it come from? It's eternal. It's always there. So for a long time, this argument simply wouldn't hold any water, until science had developed enough technology to come to the conclusion that the universe was not eternal. And I've always been fascinated by this as a Christian, because as a Christian, the Bible tells me that the universe had a beginning, right? And that God is the beginner of it. But what we find now is that science confirms that. Science confirms what the Bible teaches about the universe having a beginning. And once this happened, the scientific community could no longer simply say the universe is eternal. It's just the evidence isn't there. So I want to look at just a couple of reasons why that is. It's fascinating because as we look at these, the scientific evidence, what we're looking at is scientific evidence for the existence of God. It's scientific evidence for the finite universe. And if the universe is finite, then what? It has to have a maker. So very quickly, there's an acronym that the authors of the book give, and the acronym is SURGE, S-U-R-G-E. And just to look at the different letters that each one stands for, the S in the word surge stands for the second law of thermodynamics. And I don't know if we have any scientists in here, anybody with a scientific background. I'm not a scientist. Okay, my field is philosophical theology, so I'm not. But I really, really love reading what scientists come up with and their conclusions, and it's really, really fascinating. But the first indicator that the universe is not eternal is the second law of thermodynamics, and basically it just says that the universe is running out of usable energy. Everything is in a state of decay, moving from a state of order to disorder. For example, the universe, sometimes the illustration is like a flashlight battery. If you turn a flashlight on and you leave it on for long enough, what's going to eventually happen?
Burn out.
That light is just going to fade and it's going to go out because the energy in the battery is going to be all used up. And the universe is like that battery. It's using its energy. Now, if the universe was eternal, the energy would have been used up long ago. We wouldn't even be here. So clearly the universe had a beginning point, and the energy simply isn't used up yet. All of the energy would be gone. Everything would be in a state of random disorder. So that's the first indicator that there's a finite term for the universe. The universe has not been here forever. The second, the U in the word surge, is for the universe is expanding. The universe is expanding, and this is a very interesting thing that scientists have discovered, that there's what's called a redshift when they look at stars. All the stars and the galaxies in the universe are moving away from each other. It's an established fact. There's no science that would disagree with this, Christian or non-Christian. The universe is expanding, and it's expanding rapidly. Everything is moving away from each other. And one time I knew this astrophysicist, he was a friend of mine, and I said, what do you mean like everything's moving away from each other? He goes, well, imagine a cake. If you put a cake in the oven, as that cake is baking, the cake grows, right? And every kind of point within that cake, as it expands, it's moving away from itself. All the particles and everything's moving away from each other. And that's kind of what the universe is doing. It's expanding like a cake. Everything is moving away from each other. And so the question is for the scientist, this is what they don't like to ask, but they realize that if the universe is expanding, yesterday it was a little bit smaller than it was today. And if you go back a week, it was smaller yet. You go back a year, it was smaller yet. And if you go back far enough in time, what happens? That universe comes all the way down, and what science says is that there was all the matter, all the mass in the universe was collected into one tiny little point. They call it a singularity. The entire universe. And it is from that singularity that they would argue that the universe exploded into existence. So the question that we have for the atheist scientist who holds to that theory is, what could be strong enough to explode that into existence? Gravity would be so strong there would be nothing that could break it apart. The more mass you have, the greater the gravity. Science knows this. And so there would be just nothing that would be strong enough to break it apart. And that's why science just doesn't have an answer to where the universe has come from. But what that tells science is that it had a beginning at some point. At some point, it began. We might argue as to how long ago that was, but no scientist today can argue that the universe is eternal. The R in the surge stands for the radiation echo, and this is very interesting. In 1965, right not far from here in Holmdel, New Jersey, two scientists discovered a mysterious radiation or heat which existed in outer space. And it existed in the far reaches of outer space. And no matter which way they pointed their antenna, they were picking this up. And long story short, it turned out to be the afterglow of the Big Bang explosion, exactly as was predicted in 1948. In fact, Einstein was somebody who predicted that if there was a Big Bang at some point, through all his calculations, that there would be this afterglow. And this is what was picked up on the radio antennas. And this discovery was so huge in the scientific community that these two guys, Penzias and Wilson, won the Nobel Prize for that discovery. It gave evidence that there was an initial explosion that started the universe. And then beyond that, in the Great Massive Matter, in 1992, they had this radiation, but then they were able, with the further technology, to see that there were temperature variations or temperature ripples in this radiation. And it showed that the Big Bang explosion and the expansion was precisely tweaked to allow matter to form into galaxies, but not so strong as to cause the universe to collapse back on itself. So in other words, there was enough matter as it was expanding for universes and stars, galaxies and stars to begin to form, but the gravity wasn't so great that it would attract all the matter back in on itself. So this explosion was so perfectly fine-tuned to allow the expansion and then the formation of stars and galaxies. So what's really interesting is that we're looking at how an atheist in the scientific community is looking at the evidence and being forced to conclude that there was a beginning to the universe. I have this quote here from the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, on page 84. And I'm going to read to you a quote by a guy by the name of Robert Jastrow. Robert Jastrow, excuse me, was this was a guy who was not a Christian. He made no bones about it. Said clearly he was not a Christian. But he was actually the founder of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He was the director of the Mount Wilson Observatory in California. This is a highly credentialed scientist. Here's what he said regarding some of the things we've just talked about. He says, "Now we see how the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. The details differ, but the essential elements in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are the same. The chain of events leading to man commenced suddenly and sharply at a definite moment in time in a flash of light and energy." So there you have a scientist who's not a Christian saying, yeah, when you look at the Bible, and it tells us that there was a beginning, science has pointed us right in that same direction, right in the same direction. It is absolutely impressive, I think, that if the Bible's correct, and this is the kind of thing that we would expect to find in science. If God created the world, and He created in the universe, and He created at a definite moment in time, we expect the evidence to point there, and it does. Well, on the top of your next page, the E at the end of surge stands for the end of all days. And this is not so much scientific evidence, but more philosophical, that simply says this: an infinite series of moments has no end. Everybody knows what an infinite series would be, right? What would be an infinite series of numbers?
5.
Yes, it turns out that there is no formal answer, but any series is simply a series that continues forever. And not only does it continue forward, but it could continue backwards. That would be truly infinite, right? So a series without a beginning, just extending backwards in time. Imagine a series of moments that is infinite. Well, today we are at the end of all previous moments. This moment that's occurring right now is the end of all the moments that have come up to. But if there was an infinite number of moments prior to this, we never would reach the end. We would never actually be here. So that shows that there has to be a definite beginning to the series, and we are here at the end. If that doesn't make any sense to you, don't worry about it. That's a very philosophical thing, and philosophers love that kind of stuff. I throw it out there just because they talk about it, but there's plenty of scientific evidence to show that the universe had a beginning. So the question becomes this: if the universe had a beginning, then it must have had a beginner. And there's only two options at this point. Either no one created the universe out of nothing, or someone created the universe out of nothing. Which is more reasonable? Which is more reasonable? Obviously, someone created, right? And that's the dilemma that the atheist is in. Because it turns out that the more reasonable option is to believe that there was a creator for the universe. Now, science is all about reasoning, right? Scientists reason all the time, from the data to a conclusion, from the evidence to a conclusion. And what we're doing is on the atheist ground, we are coming up with the most reasonable option, that the universe had a beginning and therefore had a beginner. Now, I've been arguing from a scientific viewpoint. When it comes to spiritual matters, Christians are divided when it comes to this idea of creation. And there's many Christians believe that the universe is a very young universe, 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Other Christians hold that the universe or the earth could be the universe could be billions of years old, could be very, very old indeed. And whatever view you take on this is a matter of how you interpret the first chapter of Genesis. And I will say that among Christians, and I would almost be sure that in this room there are people who differ on this question. I know that some of you would believe that the earth would be young based on the 7 days of creation in Genesis, and others of you might be believing that the universe is old based on the scientific evidence, and that if the universe is expanding, how long would it take to go back in time? And generally, the scientific community believes that the universe is somewhere in the range of 12 to 15 billion years old. That's the range. They said not eternal, 12 to 15 billion, and many Christians would argue, no, it's more like thousands. So I don't know. This is just an interesting question to me. And I know that a lot of times Christians debate this. And I forgot to bring the book, which I was going to bring. There's a great book that is out there, and it has Christians showing arguing for the different views. Ken Ham would argue from the young earth. Hugh Ross argues from the old earth. And there are two others, I forget who they are, but it's a fantastic book. I can bring it in next week and show it to you, or you can ask me later and I can give you more if you're interested in reading. But each contributor argues their case, and then each contributor offers a response to the others. It's really fascinating reading. It truly is. Yeah?
How far in history can the Bible point to?
Well, see, that's the big question. It's really ambiguous. And what I want to do is just throw out to you some of the ambiguous nature of the text, so that we can have a little bit of charity when it comes to this issue and those who might disagree with us. And so I have some questions for consideration right there. And the first one would be, and if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and open them to the first chapter of Genesis. My personal view on things like this is that I don't ever want to be dogmatic unless something is absolutely clear. There are some non-negotiables in the Christian religion, such as the divine nature of Jesus, his resurrection from the dead. Those kinds of things are non-negotiable. But when it comes to things that are a little bit more not so certain, not so clear, not so explicit, we want to be careful not to be too dogmatic on these kinds of things. Let me read to you the first 5 verses of Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. God has created, from between verses 3 and 5, essentially the first day. Right? But the question is that when creation began? It would seem creation began prior to that. What's verse 2 talking about? There was the surface of the deep, there were waters. So apparently creation had begun prior to the first day that's enumerated in the text. And so what a number of Christians hold is that it's very possible that there could have been a very, very long period of time going on in verses 1 and 2 before God's activity started in verse 3. It's an interesting thought. And there are a number of Christians who hold this, especially in the scientific community. Because what you're trying to do in the scientific community is you're looking at the scientific evidence. And the evidence would suggest that the universe is billions of years old. And if you look at the text and you believe God created that the 7 days of creation are 24-hour days, you have something of a dilemma. And so what some of the scientists have done is that they've looked at the first 2 verses and said, well, we're not told in the text how much time went on in verses 1 and 2. Maybe it was billions of years. Who knows? And so it's conceivable. And John Lennox wrote an interesting book called 7 Days That Divide the World, where he proposed this very thing. John Lennox is a professor at, I believe he's at Oxford University or Cambridge, I can't forget which one, Cambridge in England. And he's a mathematics professor, and the guy's just a brilliant man, and he's a believer, a strong, strong believer. He goes around the world debating atheists. He's a fantastic speaker, and this is his theory, and many hold it, that perhaps there's a way to resolve this issue of 24-hour days and the billions of years in verses 1 and 2. It's an interesting thought, because the text doesn't give us a time frame. So, something to consider. That long time gap between the two. Something was created before the first day, and how long did it exist? We don't know. And then another point that Lennox brings out in his book is he says maybe there were time gaps between each day of creation. We're not told, it just says, and God said, and God said, and then the next creation day begins. And so we're not given an amount of time between the creation days. And so Lennox proposes, well, maybe there were long periods of time between each of the creation days. We just don't know. The text is not specific. And then finally, there's the idea of the concept of day in the scriptures. That concept of day, as I indicate here, sometimes refers to a 24-hour period. In fact, usually it does, but not always. There are also time periods that are longer than 24 hours, and in fact, that very Hebrew word for day, yom, is used in verse 1, and many Christians would argue that that's a 24-hour time period. But in chapter 2, the same word clearly refers to a long period of time. In chapter 2, if you turn to Genesis 2, verse 4, who's got a Jeanette, do you have your Bible? You don't have your Bible. Who's got a New American Standard Version?
I can have it in a second here.
Yeah, I was going to look it up. I just thought it would be easy. Look up the either New American Standard or the ESV.
I have the ESV.
Yeah. What does your chapter 2, verse 4 of Genesis say?
These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens.
Did you say the word day?
Yeah.
Yeah. So repeat that sentence again. Yeah.
These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens.
In the day, singular, that the God made the earth and the heavens. So in this verse, the word day is referring to the entire creation account all the days by the use of the word day. So that's just one example of how the word day can actually be used to refer to longer periods of time. And certainly the concept is elsewhere in the Bible. In Psalm 90, verse 4, let me just turn to that. So I think the reason why I had to read that verse is the NIV didn't translate the word day. The NIV is not always an act.
What does it
word
use,
for
the
it.
NIV?
It just says when.
Like an age or something?
It just says when the Lord created.
when.
Yeah, they leave it untranslated. But in Psalm 90, verse 4, it says this: "For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night." 1,000 years in the Lord's sight is like a day that has just gone by. So the concept is, for God, the word day may be a different kind of time frame. And then in 2 Peter in the New Testament, we have the same kind of thing. Of course, the New Testament is written in Greek, so you don't have the Hebrew word for day, but you have the concept, the same concept being expressed in 2 Peter 3:8, where Peter writes this. I'm in 1 Peter. 2 Peter 3:8, he writes this: "But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day." I put this out for your consideration simply because this can be a very emotional topic when Christians get talking about it. And that's fine. You know, we believe things very strongly. But I just want to be able to show you that there's two ways of looking at issues like this. And believers can be on either side. So let's not get too upset with our brothers and sisters if they disagree with us on an issue of this type. There are people who call themselves Christians who argue that Jesus Christ is a created being. They are the Jehovah's Witnesses. They will come to my house, they will ring my doorbell, and they will start talking to me about Jesus. Well, they have a different Jesus than the one that I worship and the one that the Bible talks about. And so I am not going to be very charitable in my discussion with them. I'm not going to agree with them. I'm going to be loving, and I'm going to explain to them the truth in the most respectful and loving way that I can, but I will stand on that truth. When it comes to an issue like this, though, we need to be very, very careful because we have believers on both sides of the issue. When you get to heaven, you're going to find that there's people there who believe that the earth was very young, a couple thousand years, and that those who believe that the earth is very old, billions of years. We're all going to be in heaven together, okay? So on an issue like that, I'm just saying there are two ways to look at it. The text is not explicit, and depending on who you read, you might get a different impression. You might get a very different impression, because some people have taken such a strong stand on this issue. And when you read Ken Ham's work, man, I mean, he goes so far sometimes as to say that you don't believe in the Bible if you don't agree with his view, and that's, I think, going too far. I think that just goes too far. He might be right in the end, but the text isn't clear enough to make that kind of dogmatic statement. And so we just, again, just be charitable. There are some of these secondary issues in the spiritual community, in the religious community, in the Christian community, where it can be argued both ways. And I think this is an example. So, any questions or thoughts? Yeah.
It's interesting that the physicist that said that everything could be traced back to a single point in time was George Lemaitre, who was a Belgian priest.
Mm.
And he was denounced by the communists because if you believed his theory, then you have a creation.
Right.
But today, the Ken Ham and the creationists denounced the George Lemaitre and his people because they don't see God's hand in the action.
Right.
So it's an interesting historical twist. The other comment I would have is, we were talking about truth in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of examples of lies in the Old Testament that were felt to be with God's will. Like Abraham said Sarah was his sister when she was his wife, and then Rahab lied, But you can't find one lie in the New Testament.
Right, right. Well, that brings up a whole another realm of discussion when we get into ethics, and we're actually going to talk about when we talk about the moral law. But even Rahab's lie, in the New Testament, she's called righteous for what she did, because the context that occurred in was very, very different. She wasn't lying for self-gain, she was lying for the greater good. And so even that is called good.
To save life.
Yeah. But we'll talk about that in a few weeks when we get to the moral argument. But you're right. This is an issue that there are twists and turns. There are different ways of perceiving things, and
But if there was any questioning of truth in the New Testament, then that would lead to questioning the resurrection.
Of course. That's why we start with the nature of truth. It corresponds with reality. It's not a matter of opinion, or it's not subjective. Yes, Bob.
Regarding that last paragraph, 6,000 years or a billion years, I know this shouts in the face of the law of non-contradiction, but can they both be true? And my argument, well, has no scientific basis, but God didn't create Adam from the embryo on, right? He created a man. And who's to say that God didn't create a billion-year-old universe 6,000 years ago?
And there are those who would argue that. There are those that God created the universe with the appearance of age. With the appearance of age. I wasn't there, maybe he did. I mean, that's a possibility. But the other side of that would be he's created a universe that is currently expanding. And so knowing that would lead people to believe that you could go back in time and that would give you a time frame. So I was speaking at a conference once, and Hugh Ross happened to be speaking there, and I was able to have a conversation with him about this. And I asked him if he had any comment on this idea of creating the universe with the appearance of age. And he basically said, well, that would make God a deceiver, because the evidence, just astronomically speaking, all points to a very, very old universe. And God would have been deceiving us to create it in that way. That was his comment.
Unless he just accelerated one phase of it, right? He works within the realm of impossibility. He could work faster.
There's probably things we don't realize. As I was talking with Christian not too long ago about this, and I read once a scientist who took Einstein's theory, his special theory of relativity, and I don't know if you have a science background, but Einstein's theory of special relativity dealt with speed, and the faster you go, the slower time actually moves. Now we don't feel that because we don't move fast enough, but when you start to approach the speed of light, time slows. And it turns out this has been experimentally verified at these very high speeds. And so there was this one scientist who said, well, if the Big Bang actually happened and there was this incredible explosion with all the matter in the universe whipping out at close to the speed of light, if you were on one of those particles of matter speeding out, time would be going very, very slowly for you because you'd be moving so fast. But to an observer not on one of those particles, there would be an awful lot of time going by. So, maybe millions of years. So depending on whether you're on the particle moving very fast, a couple of thousand years go by, you're not on the particle, maybe a million years. So his proposal was, they're both right, because it depends on your perspective. Your mind can get turned into pretzels on things like this. But I think that just goes to show that our finite understanding of the universe is just that. And God has a perspective that is, I think, going to blow us away when we get to heaven, and we really do get to find out, hopefully we will, the answers to all these very difficult questions. We'll see who's right and who's wrong, and it may turn out that none of us were right, or none of us were wrong, who knows. Any other questions before we end? Okay, let me pray, and then we'll go on in. Lord, I thank you for your revelation in your word, which is true. And I thank you for the fact that you didn't leave us having to have blind faith in you. There was so much evidence for the truth of our faith, and I thank you that you have left us this evidence. And I would just pray that you would help us as we as we fumble through these issues where we don't have enough understanding or clarity in your word, that you would help us to be gracious in our conversations with others and with those who disagree with us. Help us to always reflect the light of Christ and the love of Christ in all of our conversations with those who may disagree with us. And I pray you would just lead us to an increased faith as we think through these issues, that we would just draw closer to you and our faith would be increased. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.